Sitting down with RT for a one-on-one interview is Robert McNally, the founder and president of the Rapidan Group. Mr. McNally also served as top domestic and international energy advisor to George W. Bush. Mr. McNally, thank you very much for sitting down with RT today.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here.
You have said that the U.S., the EU, and Israel give a 50-50 probability that a war with Iran would happen. How big of a window of opportunity still exists to prevent any military action?
Well, I think it's closing very quickly. Iran, according to most non-proliferation experts, nuclear experts, will by sometime next year be at the point where they could quickly break out and enrich enough weapons-grade uranium to then later weaponize. And it's the enrichment process which is the most detectable and stoppable or delayable part of building a nuclear weapon. And I think there's a consensus among most folks, even outside those governments, most experts, that Iran is quickly approaching that level. This is according to the IAEA reports on Iran's progress. So I think that's fairly well understood. And I guess I'd say that there's a larger concern among officials that one way or the other, Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons is going to lead to a crisis of some sort. Relative to market participants. For market participants, the Iran nuclear program has been a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. We've been hearing about red lines and points of no return for 9 years. And so far there hasn't been a conflict. And so the markets are a little bit jaded. They doubt, perhaps, that this issue is as serious as it is. But I think there's no question among officials that this is taken very seriously.
Neither Europe, that's struggling economically, or the U.S., that is also facing its internal domestic problems, need a war at this moment. The Israeli public is also not so keen on going to war with Iran. So who actually benefits?
The issue is Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. And I think there's a broad understanding in Israel and Europe and the United States, around the world, I think in Russia, even in China, that a nuclear Iran is a genuine crisis for the global economy. And that needs to be avoided at all costs. You mentioned Europe's vulnerability. You're absolutely right. I think to prove the point that I was making, that European officials are very concerned about the consequences of a nuclear Iran, you have to ask yourself, why in the midst of this economic crisis as Europe is having, an existential crisis over the currency zone, why are they suddenly choosing this time in history to do something they've never done before, to embargo the imports of oil from Iran? That for Europe is an unusually strong and risky step to take for their own economy. It hurts their most vulnerable members, like Greece, which is a big importer. So you have to ask yourself, why would Europe do this? It's because they understand that whether a war or an attack on Iran takes place to delay their program, or if Iran gets nuclear weapons, either way, the consequences for global peace, global economy, oil markets are going to be dire.
But Iran is a member of the NPT. Iran is allowed to have to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. Some critics would argue, well, Israel hasn't even signed on to the NPT, and many believe that Israel has nuclear weapons. Iran is allowed to enrich uranium and have a nuclear program for peaceful purposes.
Right. You're absolutely right that under the NPT, non-nuclear weapons states are entitled to a civilian nuclear program to enrich, and many states do that, Brazil, Japan, and so forth, without raising concern in the international community that they're seeking a weapon. But there's a condition. You must prove to the international community, specifically the IAEA, that your program is peaceful. And the IAEA, meeting after meeting, report after report, has been unable to confirm that Iran's program is peaceful.
The argument, if I'm not mistaken, is we haven't been able to access, right, all the areas that we want to. Is that?
That's part of it, that Iran has not explained some signs the IAEA has discovered that Iran may be pursuing nuclear weapons. And I think it's fair to say even the more neutral IAEA officials who've looked at this would agree Iran is not being fully open in its program.
Now that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has dissolved the parliament, there are two different points of view. One, that Israel will not strike Iran before their January election. The other is that Netanyahu is much less constrained, and if he wants to strike, he will. What is your estimation?
My estimation is that if and when Israel decides, irregardless of election cycles, in Israel, the United States, or anywhere else, if Israel decides that it has exhausted every other option to attempt to stop Iran's quest for a nuclear weapon, and the only options left are military ones, then I think they will conduct that kind of operation. Now, we talk often of some sort of aerial attack, planes and missiles and so forth. That is one option, and Israel has that capability. But as we see already, there have been, and it's been reported in the press, other options, less direct options, cyber attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities, even on its broader economy and so forth. So we ought not...
You're referring to Stuxnet, right? Stuxnet,
Olympic Games, and so forth that you see reported in the press. So I think it's fair to say that both Israel and other countries that do not wish to see Iran achieve nuclear weapons are prepared to resort not only to economic sanctions, political isolation, but also military and covert options to delay the program. But in Israel's case, there's a consensus, as far as I can tell, in Israel. And it's not just Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's the Defense Minister, Ehud Barak, who comes from the left of the political spectrum in Israel. They are united, and I think they reflect a general consensus that while Israel should not rush into a military attack, that Israel should exhaust every other option, because any other option is better than a military attack. But it is a last resort, whenever that time comes, and that's something only the Israeli defense planners and political leaders will know. They will not share that with any of us, unfortunately. But when that moment comes, I believe they will act.
And do you believe that they would act alone if they choose to go to war?
If they felt they had no other choice, I believe Israel would act alone. They've made that very clear. And President Obama has made very clear that while he opposes a military attack at this time, he recognizes Israel's inability to outsource, if you will, its defense to other countries, implicitly saying he understands that if Israel has to act, it will.
By all estimations, Iran is nowhere near making a nuclear weapon. If that is the case, shouldn't the U.S. be more concerned with constraining Israel than pressuring Iran?
Well, I think, again, there is a consensus that Iran is not near having a nuclear weapon. But as I said earlier, there's also an understanding that in terms of stopping the process points that Iran must go through, the steps Iran must take, the time is now, or shortly, it's coming up very shortly, where the best opportunity to eventually stop Iran from weaponizing is about to pass. And that gets to, again, the most detectable and the most delayable part of getting a weapon is the construction and the operation of the centrifuges, and then the enrichment of feedstock that would be put through the centrifuges. Once they do that, even if it's another year or two for them to develop a trigger and and marry that to a delivery device, that is something that is very difficult, even for Israel or the United States, to detect and to stop. So that is why there's the concern right now, and this is what explains, I think, the stepped-up sanctions, even the new round of sanctions in the EU, and the heightened urgency that we see among officials.
Iran's economy is significantly in trouble. Its currency is constantly losing ground, and the Western sanctions that you have referred to are clearly taking their toll on Iran. What happens if Iran's economy is ruined? I mean, that is something that no one has spoken about. That's an unknown. How does that factor in to the current geopolitical situation?
Those who hope that Iran's government can still be persuaded to freeze its nuclear program and obey the demands of the UN Security Council and the P5+1, I think the only way they will do that is if they feel enough economic pain. And as you mentioned, the startling collapse in the currency even in recent weeks, and the drop by almost half in Iran's crude oil exports, and the real problems Iran is having with its international linkages of financing exports and imports and so forth. This is starting to have an impact. And officials from Israel to London to Washington would prefer that this approach work. And I think as we see signs that Iran's economy is cracking further, becoming more destabilized, there's more hope that perhaps we're getting closer to a point where Iran would, in its own self-interest, agree to freeze its nuclear program, ship out those parts of the program that are most concerned to the P5+1.
Are there any major factors that could push the price of oil up, aside from more fears?
Certainly. We are in a new world in the global oil market, and that sometimes gets lost here in the United States because we see such rising production and we see demand sort of softening and tapering off. So if you just looked at the United States, you would think oil prices should be much lower, we're swimming in oil, etc. But outside the United States, the oil market is very tight, and it's very, very prone to disruptions when there's geopolitical risk. But even besides geopolitical risk, what we have here is 2 billion people on the planet who want to join the billion of us in the rich countries who already have modern energy. These 2 billion people in China and India and the Middle East and Latin America, they want to drive, they want plastics, they want to fly planes. And so the demand for oil is huge. At the same time, supply growth has been very small by historical circumstances. We haven't seen the surge in production that we saw in the Soviet Union and in the North Sea and Mexico back in the 70s and 80s. So what we have here is a world oil market that features huge demand increase by very, very determined drivers and flyers and consumers of energy who want in now. They want the things that we have. At the same time, the world has had trouble in growing and increasing oil supply. As a result, the spare capacity, the amount of spare oil that can be quickly produced by OPEC, that in the past has acted as a cushion, that is gone, or that is nearly gone. It's very low. It's only 2 million barrels, 2.5 million barrels a day.
So in any way, could Iran, as well as major oil companies, be benefiting from the tension around Iran that could be driving up oil prices?
Countries and companies that sell oil benefit when the price goes up. And so for Iran, though, it's a mixed bag, because while on the one hand, the price of its crude oil that it's able to sell is higher because of these supply-demand factors I mentioned, as well as geopolitical risk premium that gets added onto the price of oil. On the other hand, as I mentioned, their exports are down by a half, down from 2.2 million barrels a day to 1 million barrels a day or even less. So their revenues, how much money they're taking in, has been cut severely. So Iran is not doing well net-net. Had they still been able to export all the oil that they were exporting even last year, at these prices, they would have been doing very well.
Robert McNally, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Thank you.